Within the world of real-time strategy, there are a few big names that have shaped the genre. Ensemble's Age of Empires' use of history gave rise to a whole subgenre, while Blizzard's StarCraft made esports a thing. But even these games owe a debt to one single developer, the creators of the first true RTS, Westwood Studios. Once they were the kings of real-time strategy, now they are but a fond memory, and their greatest creation is barely clinging on. I am, of course, talking about the Command & Conquer series. With 8 main games and plenty of expansions, the series has sold well over 30 million copies, and yet there hasn't been a new game in over a decade. What happened? In truth, there is a simple answer: mismanagement, interference, and one really bad game. In this series, I'll chart the course of the franchise, from the early foundations of an entire genre, through quite a great rise, then such a fall that the entire franchise seems dead. There is still a glimmer of hope though, as we shall find out as I play through Command & Conquer from the top. The roots of the RTS go all the way back to the early 80s, but the first true RTS was Dune 2, based on the film of Frank Herbert's novels. It was released in 1992 by Westwood and would lay the groundwork for their next project. Command & Conquer, later retroactively referred to as Tiberian Dawn, was first released in September of 1995 for MS-DOS PCs, followed soon after by versions for Mac and Windows over the next couple of years. This period would also see the release of the first expansion pack of the series. The Covert Operations added 15 extra missions, plus a few other extras. Computers would not be the only platform for the game. By 1999, all 3 main 5th gen consoles had received their own port of the game, with some bonus missions. The PlayStation and Saturn editions are almost identical, but the N64 release completely revamped the graphics, utilising 3D models instead of the sprite work of every other version. Over the years, the game has appeared in multiple compilations, the main ones being the First Decade, somewhat ironically named given the recent history of the franchise, and the Ultimate Collection, which added only 3 more games. These releases have supposedly been updated to allow them to run on the operating systems in use at the time of their release. In 2007, the full game and Covert Operations were made freeware, and can now be legally downloaded, although you will probably be better off downloading a version with the unofficial 1.06 patch for the most compatible and stable experience. This patch also allows higher resolutions, though I wouldn't push it too far, as we'll talk about later. Now we come to that glimmer of hope. In 2020, the Command & Conquer Remastered Collection was released, half of which is this game. Development of the Remastered Collection was led by Petroglyph Games, a studio founded by former Westwood Studios staff. Not only were all the graphics completely recreated at much higher detail levels, the collection includes every single mission, including those console exclusive missions and the full Covert Operations, along with a heap of behind the scenes bonus material. I played through the remaster while also sampling the First Decade release and even the PS1 port. Let's dive in. At its core, the gameplay of Command & Conquer is to command and conquer. To be a little less sarcastic, you take control of a base or selection of units, and must use them to explore the map and complete whatever mission objective has been given to you. Often, that objective is to destroy every single enemy unit on the map. But there are plenty where you have specific targets that must be either eliminated or captured with an engineer. During those missions where the objective is total victory, capturing enemy structures does count towards the goal, and as a bonus, captured structures will give you access to any units they can produce, so long as you have the other prerequisites for those units. So far, there is not much to really differentiate Command & Conquer from most other real-time strategy games. Hardly surprising, given it was one of the first and inspired many of the others. Yet even this first game has elements that set Command & Conquer as a series apart from all but those most directly inspired by it. The biggest of these, and the most obvious, is the main interface, the sidebar. Where many other RTS games, including most of its contemporaries, had interfaces based around selecting a unit or structure to access their particular build menu, Command & Conquer has every buildable unit or structure in the sidebar. This means you can easily be creating units while still focused on the current action. The sidebar also houses the minimap if you possess a communications centre, easy access to buttons for repairing or selling buildings, and clear indicators for the game's 2 resources, which we'll get to in time. The sidebar can also be hidden, handy for if you want to view a little more of the battlefield, or if you are in a mission without a base, where the sidebar will be effectively redundant. There are a couple of drawbacks, especially in early versions. Only a small number of items can be on the sidebar at any one time, forcing you to scroll up or down through the units or structures. It's a touch clunky and actually works a little better on the console versions, which have the added advantage of separating infantry and vehicles in the sidebar, so you can easily build from both categories without scrolling. All early versions also have the limit of only allowing 1 unit from each category to be queued at a time. Changes to the sidebar are perhaps the biggest and most welcome made by the remaster. Drawing from later games in the series, the remaster changes to a tabbed system for different categories, along with the greater resolutions allowing more items to be shown in the sidebar. All structures or units are now easily accessible. As a further quality of life improvement, infantry and vehicles can be queued like later games, making building an army more focused on overall strategy, instead of efficiently timing your clicks. But before you can build an army, you will need to build a base. Command & Conquer has always been about base building, to the point where the series is often categorised as a base building RTS. There is only a single mainline game that does not feature base building, and, well, we shall get to that in due time. Back to the task at hand. The heart of every base is the MCV, or Mobile Construction Vehicle. Keyword being mobile. In many missions you will be provided with an MCV to build your base from scratch. It can be freely moved about the map, then deployed wherever you choose, if there are no obstructions. Just be careful though, as while the MCV has decent armour, it is completely unarmed and unable to protect itself. Choosing a location for your base does require you to keep a few things in mind: space, resources, and defensibility. The latter two are simple on the surface. You need money, and you want to have an easy time protecting your base, with preferably just one approach to cover. These do have deeper considerations that I'll touch on later when I discuss other aspects in more detail. Space is important to keep in mind due to the limitations on how you expand your base. Once the MCV is deployed into the construction yard, you will be able to build structures from the sidebar. Each structure has a cost, a build time, and a power requirement. Already we reach another aspect that sets Command & Conquer apart. In many RTS games, all your resources must be in position first, before you can begin building. Don't have enough wood? Sorry, you can't build that. Not so in Command & Conquer. You can start building whenever you like, and the build timer will tick down so long as you have the money. If you have
insufficient funds,
building will halt until money comes in. Once a structure has reached a state of
construction complete,
you can then place it. This is where space comes into play. You will be shown the footprint of the building as a set of tiles that will be white or red. It's pretty clear, white is okay, red is not. To start with, you must place a structure with at least one tile of that structure adjacent to another structure you already own. Essentially, the build radius of a structure is 1. If you are within the build radius, the footprint will turn white, unless there is an obstruction such as trees, rocks or units. In which case, the tile with the obstruction will turn red to indicate its location. This is why space is important. If you are in too enclosed an area, you may be unable to actually place your structures. Yet it is not entirely fatal. If needed, you can use walls to extend your base. A single wall piece will still act like any other structure, providing that one tile of build radius, so you can work around obstacles or spread structures out. Walls can also be useful for building defensive structures further out from the centre of your base, or expanding to new Tiberian fields without another 5,000 credit MCV. There are other possible uses, but we'll get there later. Back to the base, the first structure you can, and in fact must, build is a power plant. This provides you with power. As mentioned earlier, you do not need to have sufficient power to build a structure. However, once it is built, placed and drawing power, if your base needs more than your power plant's supply, you will be left in a state of
low power.
While under low power, some structures, like certain base defences or the communications centre and its radar, will cease function entirely, rendering you defenceless and blind. Others, particularly production structures, will have their build speed dramatically reduced. Essentially, your entire war effort will be affected, potentially fatally. Which, conversely, means attacking enemy power plants can be a valuable strategy. So, you have power. Now what? Well, by building that power plant, you now have some
new construction options.
This is how Command & Conquer limits your access to certain units and structures, known within the genre as a tech tree. Command & Conquer keeps it simple, using the structures themselves as the only prerequisites, rather than having to research individual technologies. Obviously, the production structures are required to produce any infantry or vehicles, but at most, units will require only one additional structure to be recruited. There is one last factor to keep in mind when building your base and subsequently your army, and that is the number of production structures you possess. While having multiple war factories won't give you additional build queues, extras beyond the first will greatly reduce build time, letting you rapidly churn out vehicles. The same does hold true for building structures, though having multiple construction yards is less common. There are few missions where you are even capable of building MCVs, and even when you can, 5,000 credits is a lot of investment. So, we've covered building your base and your army. Now the question is, which army? Because like many RTS games, the two factions are far from identical. And we aren't just talking visually. Each faction's unit selection results in fairly different playstyles. We'll go into their narrative aspects later, but for now we're mainly focusing on how each faction works from a gameplay perspective. GDI, the Global Defense Initiative, draws inspiration from the modern military, or at least the modern military of the mid-90s. As such, their units trend towards the heavily armed and armoured. They tend to be more expensive than their closest counterparts, but they pack a bigger punch while being tougher to stop. Exemplified best by the Mammoth tank, a dual-barreled behemoth with bonus rocket launcher that can even heal itself to a point. Not everything in their arsenal is big and beefy. The APC lets you protect infantry and move them around the map quickly, and they also have access to the Orca, a fast-moving aircraft capable of striking at opportune targets and getting clear in moments. In general though, GDI excel in stand-up combat, and most of their units are decent all-rounders, but they do have options for other strategies. Their mortal enemies, the Brotherhood of Nod, have a different and much more varied playstyle. Many of their basic units are quick-moving and cheap, without too much compromise on firepower. They tend to be weaker on the armour front though, so hit-and-run tactics are often the best use of Nod's forces, their stealth tank standing out well in this regard, as a great unit for poaching enemy harvesters and then hiding from the response. Nod's units also lean towards greater specialisation, such as flame weaponry capable of cutting through entire waves of infantry and razing structures in moments. However, the flame weapons have an area of effect, making friendly fire a distinct and damaging possibility. Overall, Nod is a more tactical faction, requiring smart use of forces. Close micromanagement and using the right units at the right time will give you an edge. Neither faction has a clear and obvious advantage on paper at least. There were some small aspects of multiplayer that gave GDI an edge in the original release, but that edge was only really relevant in high levels of play. What is more important for the average player is knowing how to use your units most effectively. A large aspect of which is the weaponry of the units and what targets are most vulnerable to which weapon type. We've already mentioned flame weaponry's strengths against infantry and structures, but it is less effective against heavier armour. Tank cannons and bazookas are the best options here, but they have limited use against infantry. It boils down to a rock-paper-scissors style system. Going all in on one type of unit leaves you open to the counter. And while some weapons are objectively better, not much can withstand artillery pieces or missile launchers. Everything is balanced by unit durability, movement speed, and more importantly, cost. Everything costs money, and managing your economy is a crucial part of the game. Most RTS games feature some sort of economic gameplay. Many opt for single points that a structure must be built on, others have resource points that are static and gradually depleted as resources are extracted by worker units. Command & Conquer is definitely more like the latter, but has its own spin on the concept. In the game, you must harvest the material that gives the sub-series its name, Tiberium. This material is key to the story, and we'll talk about it more then, but in terms of gameplay, Tiberium appears as large fields of easily identifiable green crystals. Tiberium is not a particularly friendly material, and infantry walking through a field of it will take damage, and can even be killed by the ground. It has another interesting characteristic, in that if left on its own, Tiberium fields will gradually expand over time, an effect that occurs much more quickly if the field has a blossom tree present. These blossom trees will even provide this effect if all of the Tiberium has been harvested from a field. It's not a particularly rapid effect. You harvest Tiberium at a much faster rate than it regrows, but it does mean in a long game, you are never completely out of money sources. To turn it into the credits used to fund your war effort, you must use harvesters to collect the Tiberium from a field and transport it to a refinery, where it will be slowly added to your bank balance. But there is a limit to how much Tiberium you can store. A single refinery can store 1,000 credits worth, which is not even 2 harvester loads, which means
Silos needed.
you will need silos. These are cheap structures that can each store an additional 1,500 credits of Tiberium, allowing you to save up money, but in a way also making it vulnerable. If an engineer captures a Tiberium silo, they will steal the Tiberium inside it too. This is rarely a problem for players, as you should be spending money as fast as you can harvest it. Instead, it is often an opportunity, even a strategy in some missions, to capture unguarded silos and give yourself a monetary boost, while depriving the enemy of funds. You probably do want 1 or 2, just in case, as harvesters will keep on harvesting and unloading regardless of your bank balance, effectively wasting resources if you are already at the limits of your storage and you are distracted by other things. It's not the only stupid thing about the harvester's AI that you must contend with. The way they proceed through a field of Tiberium often ends up being horribly inefficient. After harvesting a tile of Tiberium, the harvester will move to a random nearby tile. Once full, it will head to a refinery. Fair enough so far. Once unloaded though, the harvester will proceed to a random tile near to the last one it was on, before it resumes harvesting, even if that tile is the furthest from the refinery. Doesn't sound too bad, but given how glacially slow harvesters move, it can massively reduce your rate of income, something that can be crucial in intense missions or multiplayer. Multiple harvesters can also be less useful than you think. If the target refinery is occupied at the moment the harvester is full, it will instead aim for a queued position behind the refinery, even if the occupying harvester leaves the refinery during the travel time. It wastes so much time and often leads to a cascading effect, as by the time Harvester 2 actually starts to unload, Harvester 1 is almost full again and the cycle starts over. It's why I'd advise against building harvesters on their own. Just build more refineries, then each has its own to go to. Once the first field is done with, the harvesters will continue to follow their programming, and will target the next tile of Tiberium as the crow flies. And, well, it doesn't always make things any better thanks to the AI. The phrase artificial intelligence is genuinely stupid is rather apt. I will preface this section of negativity by pointing out that it was 1995, and the game's AI was leaps and bounds beyond what came before, and even many of its contemporaries. But compared to anything more recent, it is obvious that the AI uses quite simple and extremely abusable rules. The aspect relevant to not just harvesters but all units is pathfinding, which is maybe a little too kind a name. When a unit is given a target space, it will attempt to go directly to that space in a straight line, which is fine until there is any kind of obstacle. The unit will then trace around the perimeter of the object. For trees, this isn't too bad, but trees are not the only obstacle. There are also much bigger obstacles, such as rivers, cliffs, or perhaps a sandbag wall. When a unit encounters one of these, it will do the same thing and try to go around by hugging the obstacle all the way until it reaches the target tile, even if it is the least efficient and potentially even the most dangerous path to take. Countless infantry have died because this pathfinding took them on long walks through Tiberian fields, when the sensible route is shorter, safer, and less likely to have units get caught on each other. There's another problem. Anytime there is a narrow path, you often get treated to the waltz of the tanks as they try to decide who goes first. Units that do proceed through the narrow space, especially bridges, will do so single file, and then continue on towards their target space, which can result in your whole army streaming into the face of the enemy in a strung out line, getting picked off one by one. Faster units will also race ahead, and as they are usually weaker, they will probably get shredded before your heavier units even arrive. It means, to best minimise frustration, you are better off moving your units short range and micromanaging them through any tighter spots. On the flip side, the AI for computer-controlled factions can't micromanage on that scale, meaning you can use tight spaces to funnel enemy forces into a kill box once you get their attention, which is fairly easy. By attacking an enemy unit, that unit will enter a combat state in which they try to destroy the attacking unit, even if that means ignoring other units that are passing by. The enemy unit will even follow the target if it remains within a certain range, allowing you to draw it out of position for an easy kill. You can even trigger the AI to throw everything it has at you by attacking one of their harvesters. This can be incredibly threatening if you are not prepared. If you are, well, it becomes trivial. Because all of the units come at once, they will often end up suffering the same issues I mentioned earlier. Faster units arrive first and get destroyed, while the rest of the army gradually filters through any tight spots to approach one at a time. You can even choose not to fight them at all. When I said extremely abusable, boy did I mean it. And it all centres on the cheapest thing you can build in the game: that humble sandbag wall. You may remember me mentioning that you can use walls to extend your base. The thing is, you can do this indefinitely. You can literally build walls from one side of the map to the other. But that isn't what makes them truly broken. That AI pathfinding? If you build a wall that blocks a route, the AI will treat it as any other obstacle and go the long way round. If you build walls that block all routes, the AI will reach the wall and stop. It's so broken because, despite the fact that sandbag walls can be destroyed by a single tank shot or a rocket, the enemy AI cannot target them. The AI will only fire on units or non-wall structures if they get into range, at which point the wall may be destroyed, releasing the enemy force. But if you keep out of range, the enemy units will simply stack up on the other side of the wall, confused and unthreatening. And this is only the middle of the brokenness scale of walls. On the lighter side is using the walls to expand to new Tiberian fields. The heavier side is a similar consideration, except you push it further. Much further. Far enough, in fact, to build within the enemy base. You can wall off production structures, or even place your own. You can drop a barracks and spew out engineers to capture the enemy structures, or just cause carnage by placing high-powered defensive structures right in the middle, all without having to do any work beyond patiently building a long wall. So the unit AI is broken, and easy to take advantage of. Its one strength is its object-oriented approach. Each unit is classed as an individual, and will follow its own current behaviour set without affecting other units. On the more positive side, the faction level AI works reasonably well, for the time at least. It is based upon a behaviour system with a range of states that determine how the AI acts. These will change depending on the situation, such as the build status of their base, if they are under attack, or in the case of that swarm response, if a harvester is threatened. If you know the general conditions for certain behaviours, it does become easier to manipulate the AI, but the same is true even for most modern games. If you are going in reasonably fresh, the AI of Tiberian Dawn is a decent enough challenge without feeling unfair. This is because of possibly the best thing about the AI. It mostly follows the rules. Many early RTSs would automatically grant the AI units and money, or even have each mission almost totally scripted. In Command & Conquer, there is no free money and no free units, barring those in place at the start of the mission. It costs time and money for the AI to build units or structures, in the same way it does for the player. The AI does get one advantage, in that it receives way more credits per harvester load, but it still needs that harvester to actually return to the refinery. If you destroy either, the AI must build a replacement. This is why targeting the economy is still a strong strategy. No harvesters means no money. No money means no units for defence, which means you can roll through their base at will. Despite a couple of strong aspects, from a modern standpoint, it doesn't hold up. There are too many ways to break the AI of Command & Conquer. For its time, it was great, and some of the drawbacks always were essentially a trade-off. The developers could have made more intricate algorithms for pathfinding, but it would have potentially ruined the game. Remember, it was first released in 1995, when top-of-the-line CPUs were single cores with clock speeds of 200 MHz, and it gave those a run for their money as it was. The large armies that make the game so impressive and memorable would have been impossible to field without catastrophic slowdown if the unit AI was significantly more intricate. Of course, the remaster could have fixed many of the problems with the AI, and the development team did in fact experiment with some of the AI coding. They found that it not only made the campaign much more difficult, it also started to lose the feel of the original game, so the decision was made to keep the AI as it was originally designed, only fixing what was genuinely bugged in the original, in order to ensure the campaign was still balanced and was still what people remembered. The one area where the remaster did tweak a couple of aspects of gameplay is the multiplayer, in order to combat that slight edge that GDI had. Now, I'm not one for competitive multiplayer, so I can't honestly comment on those aspects, but the tweaks were made with input from the community, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. If you do want to play multiplayer, you have a couple of options. The Windows versions and those that appear in the compilations no longer have native support for online multiplayer. LAN play may work, but I didn't bother testing. The other options are just so much easier in every way. If you want to experience multiplayer closest to its original form, the CNCnet community keeps multiplayer for all of the old games live through unofficial patches. And with the game now being freeware, they provide the full game pre-patched for easy download and installation. The best way though is the remaster. It supports custom games for up to 6 players, with a decent range of maps included, along with easy integration for fan-made maps that can be created with the included map editor. The game also includes a 1v1 quick match ladder if you want to put your competitive skills to the test and prove yourself. Skirmish games are also now available if you'd prefer just taking on some AI players, but without the few scripted elements of missions, the AI runs purely on its behaviours, and with no wider personality profiles for AI factions, it becomes stale after a few games. Single player gamers will definitely get more out of the campaign. On which note, for many, the campaign was the only way they experienced Command & Conquer. Lacking a skirmish mode and with the internet very much in its infancy, the single player game was all they could play. Just as well that despite those AI issues, the campaign is still a fantastic example of how to do it. Each faction has their own campaign, GDIs consisting of 15 missions and nods of 13, though GDI's first few missions have a more distinctly tutorial feel to them. Not necessarily a bad thing, especially at a time when the genre was new, and even today it is a masterclass in teaching the basics without being excessively hand-holding, using many of the same tricks that Super Mario Bros. World 1-1 uses. Both campaigns gradually introduce the faction's arsenal of weapons, using a hidden technology level to restrict access, even if the requisite buildings have been constructed. It also gradually increases the challenge, not just from the opponents and their similarly growing arsenal, but also from the terrain. Maps start off small, often offering your base a reasonable degree of protection, with later maps reversing that trend. Larger maps and obstacles and choke points that favour the opposition instead. Some early missions will provide you with a base already in situ, others will give you the choice of base location, and yet more will ask you to complete set objectives with just the units you are presented with at the start. The variation is nice and keeps things fresh, though some of the latter category of missions can feel a little restrictive. There is often a critical path that must be followed, and deviation generally means failure. On the subject of variation, between those 15 or 13 missions, there are many opportunities where you are given a choice of 2 or more different mission locations, and these will affect which mission you play. Often, the different missions have similar objectives, just with different maps. But there are plenty where the choices will lead to wildly different missions. It's a great touch, making the player feel more involved and vastly increasing the game's replayability. It also means that there are actually 26 GDI missions to play and 25 for Nod. The remaster allows you to select any of the variant levels after you have completed at least one of the choices, making life a bit simpler for completionists. Within each mission there is a limited amount of scripting, but not too much. Most of the control is left to the AI behaviours. From what I could tell, there were scripts in place that would trigger when the player satisfied certain conditions, such as clearing out anti-air defences to spawn a transport helicopter. Others would alter the AI behaviour once the player reveals certain map locations, allowing the player to build up in relative peace before the AI starts to attack, and the final one controls the routes through which the AI attacks, unless you have decided to use those mildly broken tactics we discussed earlier. When it comes to world design, the game is rather limited. The two campaigns take place in different continents. GDI's missions are all in Europe, while Nods see you battling across Africa. One neat aspect is the progression map, where you choose your next mission, showing the rhythm of the war. The little fact file that pops up when you choose an objective is a fun bonus, with small differences between the two factions reinforcing their narrative attitudes. In a mission, really the only difference is a visual one. Being set in Europe, GDI's missions have a green grassy background. Nods have yellow desert. It does lack variety. There is a reasonable amount of other assets such as civilian villages, but still not enough to really give missions an individual distinctiveness until the full layout has been revealed. There are very few missions I could instantly identify from just a single screenshot. The expansion pack, the Covert Operations, grants a few changes insofar as you can play as GDI in a desert map and Nod in a temperate one. It is limited to the elements from the base game though, so there isn't much to impress visually. But then again, the expansion wasn't sold on the idea of visuals. It was marketing as having extra missions, 15 of them in fact. 7 for GDI, and 8 for Nod, bringing them to 33 missions each if you want to be precise. These missions are a little tougher, with a few small twists such as unwritten secondary objectives that may make the mission easier, or openings that put you on the back foot straight away. It is mostly more of the same, which is not a bad thing. Mission design is one of the strengths of Command & Conquer. And I did say mostly. Technically, the Covert Operations has 5 additional hidden missions that are, well, interesting to say the least. That guy, by the way, was Kane, which brings us neatly to talking about the narrative. The biggest feature that sets the story of Command & Conquer apart from its contemporaries, in fact what sets it apart from all but a handful of video games, are the full motion video or FMV cutscenes that the narrative is presented through. Where other games would be generous if they gave you an animated face and some voice work, or worse, just plain old scrolling text, Command & Conquer has actual live-action cutscenes for mission briefings, with a few CGI spectacle moments sprinkled in to show units in action. They help to establish the world and to ground it. It's far easier to relate to a story that takes place in the near real world and features actual human beings, compared to a fantasy world with scrolling text accompanied by a voice. Granted, some of the performances aren't going to win any awards, but when you consider some of the actors were actually members of the development team, they do a solid enough job for presenting the campaigns. The only area of disappointment is that the Covert Operations missions lack any FMVs. So while the missions themselves are a great expansion, the lack of context makes them less attractive to story-focused gamers, who will get more from the campaigns. Each campaign has its own story, with the 2 running roughly in parallel until the later missions which split into the differing fates for the world. GDI are a United Nations force and clearly the designated good guys, even in the game's code. Their goal is trying to protect civilian populations from the Brotherhood. Their plot deals not only with the fight against Nod, but also the politics surrounding being a multinational organisation. Press conferences and questions of funding crop up, especially in the wake of Nod's media manipulation, something that feels mildly prophetic given the state of news media at the moment. General Shepard is our main contact, providing the majority of mission briefings, but when he is dealing with the aforementioned political wrangling, he is supported by Carter and Morelli, GDI field commanders of Army and Air Force respectively. It helps sell the combined arms nature of GDI's military setup. The GDI campaign also has a side focus on the effects of Tiberium itself, featuring Dr. Mobius. From the game itself, it's hard to tell if he is an actual genius or simply a bullshit merchant. It's Carter who really drives home the dangers of Tiberium though, and we even see him starting to suffer Tiberium poisoning, setting up elements that will be expanded upon in later titles. Nod, on the other hand, are the bad guys. They talk a freedom line, but are clearly more interested in themselves and their own power. We are initially briefed by Seth, who epitomises the self-centred and jealousy-fueled internal politics of the Brotherhood. Then we meet Kane, who has an incredible entrance that instantly puts us on his side. Enigmatic and intriguing, Kane is magnetic in a way, with Joe Kukin absolutely nailing the qualities that make him such a powerful character and really sell the idea that a cult could have grown up around the man. His performance is helped by a certain awareness of the narrative genre, riding that line between dramatic and tongue-in-cheek without plunging too far into either. I think what makes the narrative and world building so strong is that everything ties into it. Not just relevant mission briefings or CGI scenes, but even elements of gameplay. The story developments around Tiberian are shown by its effect on infantry, and even the interface treats you as part of the world. In fact, even the original installation process is what you could call in character. From the moment you inserted that disc, you were drawn into the world. Sadly, the compilation releases lacked this installation screen. But, leaning fully into both highlights of the original and the spirit of the project, it was brought back and reimagined for the remaster, making anyone who installed the DOS original grin from ear to ear. The remaster also does its best with the cutscenes. When you consider they were originally compressed to be sufficient for 320 by 200 pixel resolutions, they are not great viewing at anything beyond 640 by 400, and by the time you get up to full HD or higher, they look frankly a mess. In an ideal world, the original recordings would have been used to deliver the scenes for the high-res remaster. Sadly, they could not be found, so the devs settled for utilising AI upscaling. It's far from perfect, but even at 1440p they are passable and they don't pull you out of the game. I mean, depending on your friends or family and experience with webcams, it almost fits the game's concept of you being a remote commander. We've all got friends, family or co-workers with internet and webcams poor enough that the footage comes across looking like a 144p YouTube video. It isn't the only area where the remaster improves things. Let's get into our final section, graphics and sound. We'll start at the beginning with the DOS version. I already mentioned the DOS version ran at 320 by 200, and as such most of the art assets were designed for those displays. From what I could tell, the upgraded Windows 95 version utilises the same exact art assets. What it does instead is increase the size of the camera to produce a 640 by 400 resolution, or 480 depending on the settings and the display. While on a screen percentage scale it does make everything smaller, it still looks okay, and the greater visibility is often actually helpful. Unofficial patches that increase the resolution will do so in the same way, which can be a little detrimental. Most will restrain it to 1280 by 800, but you can push it further, to the point where units are minute and the entire map is visible on screen. At that point, it actually becomes hard to play. The remaster rectifies this problem, granting up to 4K resolutions natively, with completely redrawn sprites, though if you prefer the blockier old style sprites, with the tap of a button you can revert to them at will. You're also now capable of changing the zoom level, so you can be as close in as the DOS version, or a notch or two further out than the Windows 95 edition. The console versions seem to run similar resolutions to the DOS release, but refined to the individual console's native output. At all official resolutions, the visuals are mostly clear. Buildings and vehicles are distinctive and easy to tell apart. The infantry, not so much. Now, I'm not sure what could have been done differently while keeping the scale sensible, as there are only so many pixels to make the infantry. But because it needs to be clear which faction the infantry are with, most of their sprite is the colour of the faction. You only have the weapons to tell them apart, and while isolated it is fairly simple to identify each type, once you have a group it is much harder, which can be problematic if you need to pull back your ally-immolating flamethrower and keep selecting bazooka troopers because from some angles they look the same and you are rushing to try and avoid a literal friendly fire incident. It's the only tweak I think the remaster should have made that it didn't. With the higher res they get more pixels they could have used to make the basic infantry types just that little bit more distinct. The commando and engineer are easy to tell apart from other infantry, even when moving the window rapidly, so it isn't like there isn't precedent. This is not a game-breaking complaint, just a minor annoyance. The sound of the units is less ideal. There's a few pretty generic voices spread between all the units, instead of unique voices and lines.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Awaiting orders. Yes, sir. Unit reporting. Yes, sir.
The main exception is the commando, and to be fair, it does make his appearances more memorable.
I'm got a present for you. Real tough guy. You got it.
Elsewhere, the sound design is pretty solid. Most weapon types have their own sound effects, and you can identify most of them even if they're off screen. There are few things that make you panic more than exploring the map and hearing the rising charge of an obelisk of light right before it blasts your scout. If there is one issue, it's that some of these sound effects trend a bit too loud compared to the others. A few obelisks or missile launchers can be deafening compared to tanks or infantry.
Yeah? Okay. Yes, sir. Unit reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
The voice lines of Eva can be a bit irritating too. Not the voice itself, which is iconic, and it's great that the voice actress came back to re-record the voice lines in high quality for the remaster. The issue is the repetitive nature. Hearing
Insufficient funds.
gets grating when it happens every minute. To be fair, this has been tweaked in the remaster to make it less common, but I would have preferred some finer control. Maybe set some parameters for them to trigger that can be customised to alert you when you need alerting. I am grasping at straws for complaints, and this one might just be a personal annoyance. Kinda like someone coming up to you and pulling out your earphones to shout that the sky is blue when you are listening to your favourite tunes. Actually, it's exactly like that, because the soundtrack of Command & Conquer is an absolute belter. Composed by Frank Kaplacki, the soundtrack is tough to really describe concisely without just saying awesome. Synth heavy with a decent chunk of electronic music. There's an undercurrent of rock throughout, with smatterings of chunky metal riffs. And even bits of hip-hop inspiration. While it sounds chaotic, it's a soundtrack that fits the tone of the game and just feels satisfying in almost every situation. When things are quiet on the action front, you can listen and enjoy. Then once the action kicks in, it adds to the intensity of the battle. It's an impressive feat that manages what many games have to deliberately design through morphing tracks on the fly. There are other ways in which it was groundbreaking. The soundtrack was actually one of the first in the entire industry to use digitised audio files instead of MIDI. And while they are of middling quality in the original release, it helped set the industry on a course towards using high-quality modern MP3s. It was also implemented in such a way that you can easily skip tracks you don't like by going into the menu. The remaster goes that extra step further too. Not only did Klapacki go back and remaster the entire soundtrack, he also collaborated with the Tiberian Sons, a fan band that does remixes of gaming tracks, particularly from Command & Conquer. This collaboration resulted in a further selection of remixes for the game. With the original versions included too, players have been served with a wealth of music to serve as a backdrop to their commanding and conquering, all served up in an easy to use jukebox, letting you build playlists of your favourite tracks within the game itself. It's time, unfortunately, to bring this video to a close. I could probably talk for easily another hour about this game, but that would probably bore you to death. So, how does Command & Conquer measure up? Well, the gameplay is still very good, even today. Simple to pick up, difficult to master. It's an ideal place to stand. It's not excessively deep, there's no upgrades or multi-branched tech trees, but the factions and their units have distinctive roles and playstyles, with enough advantages and weaknesses to still ensure that you have to think, that you have to use the namesake of the genre, strategy. Considering how young the genre was, I mean Command & Conquer is considered one of the progenitors for a reason, there are a few issues. The enemy AI is competent on the surface, but easy to break. Unit AI can be all over the place, and even with the valid excuse of making best use of available computing power, it doesn't hold up today, so does have to fall as a mark against the game. Some visuals could be a little clearer, though for the most part the player is easily able to command their army. The soundtrack is a classic, hands down, but the biggest factor in the game's favour, beside the gameplay, is the narrative. Between the use of FMVs and the tying of all elements into a cohesive whole, the story of Command & Conquer is still fantastic. Final verdict? If you have any interest in strategy games, you need to play this game. As to the question of which version, it's a simple answer. The remaster is by far the best way to play. It runs happily on modern hardware with no patches or tinkering, though it doesn't require a beastly machine to run. The multiplayer, if that interests you, is easy to access and features built-in ladder play. It doesn't cost much and includes not just every scrap of Command & Conquer, but the next game too, so there's barely any reason not to pick it up. The console versions, while impressive in many ways with some well-made alterations, are still not a patch on the PC versions, and if anything has been cut from this video, it was probably the console content. And that is that for Command & Conquer. A starting point for the series, and the trajectory is upwards. Next month I'll be continuing my quest through Final Fantasy with Final Fantasy VIII. Then after that, we'll see where Command & Conquer would go with its sort of sequel, and the second half of the remaster, when I play Command & Conquer Red Alert from the top.